Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Singleton design pattern, how to understand when or if you should use it, and I'll provide an example of how I feel it still has a place despite what many might advise. When describing any of the programming design patterns, it's important to remember that they're not really functions or code or classes directly. They're instead guidelines to solving common programming problems. So try not to get bogged down in what the syntax is, but rather what the problem tries to solve and any suggestions towards solving those problems. The Singleton pattern will provide global access to variables and methods inside a class that must, by its design, only allow a single instance of itself to exist. And it must do its best to enforce this, otherwise how would you be sure you're accessing the correct global variables when you do so? The Singleton aims to simplify access to data and to save time and sometimes performance in your code when it would be expensive to reference the variables another way. The Singleton enforcement of a single instance also helps in circumstances where having more than one instance would literally break your program. My example today, and where I feel singletons are the easiest to justify, is with game development. And today I'll show you one of the more common uses of a singleton in game development, and that is the GameManger object. The GameManger is generally an object in your game that is used to manage certain systems, and it's used when you need those systems to persist at all times from one level to the next or through different scenes. The GameManger is a center point of data storage or game state that many parts of your program will need to access, and as such, designing it as a singleton will save you time and potentially performance where large numbers of objects need to dynamically access this data. There are a lot of arguments against use of singletons, even in this circumstance, but they generally boil down to two main arguments, and that is that they remove the ability for you to create a second instance of an object, which of course is the point. But what about a month or a year down the track when you suddenly realize that your now very large program needs a second instance of whatever you happen to create as a singleton, perhaps for testing or for other functionality, and then you can't do that because it's a singleton and it can only be instantiated once. This is where you really need to ask yourself when creating a singleton, do I only ever need one instance? And not only that, will having more than one instance of this object fundamentally break your game? And if that's true, then perhaps you can use a singleton. The second argument that I see quite regularly is that singletons go against some of the fundamental concepts of OOP by introducing what's called high coupling. I'll give you an example here in my code of how that might be a problem. So looking at the code here, you can see that I have a public variable in my singleton called player health, and I have a whole bunch of objects. Let's just say I have a whole bunch of objects in my scene that are going to want to access that player health and change it. What if down the road I decide that my player now needs to utilize armor? If I have to modify this public variable, then I'm going to have to go and modify all of the references to that public health variable everywhere else in my code. And you can see as your program gets bigger, that means that the changes from the singleton side are going to ripple out and get bigger and bigger as your program extends. I'd like to show you a way that you can potentially reduce the gravity of the high coupling issue. This is an example of another way you might write that same GameManger singleton in a way that reduces the downsides of the high coupling, so it may not be such an issue. So if you look at the code here, you can see that I've added a variable for armor, and I still have my public health variable, and I've given a property to access the armor as well. But you notice that I've allowed other functions to get the variable, but not to set them. And instead of allowing them to set the variable directly, you create a mutator variable that will apply what you need to do to the variables themselves indirectly. So if you have a look, I have two new functions. I have apply modifier and I have change health. So what will happen is that instead of directly accessing the health, they will call the public function change health, and they will pass it a variable, say damage, that is going to change the health by. And instead of changing the health directly, they will first call the second function that I have, apply modifier, and pass that variable to that. So in this apply modifier, I could basically do whatever I wanted. So in this case, I'm just timesing the amount by the armor variable that I've created, but I could do any number of other things, apply status effects or all sorts of things in this apply modifier. And any changes I make in there do not ripple out to the places where it's been accessed in the code, because all they need to deal with is change health, and that doesn't need to change because I apply any modifications after I receive the values. In conclusion, only use singletons when the two requirements are met. So, will having multiple instances of this class break my code, meaning stop my code from working altogether? And do I need global access to these variables? Is that an absolute necessity? Will it save so much time that I couldn't do without it? And also remember that the bigger your program is going to get, the more chances there are for the singleton to become a problem. So the more careful you need to be when designing its layout. Also remember that you never actually need to use a singleton pattern. There are many methods for preventing or helping with the problems that a singleton tries to solve. It just is a fairly simple way to go about solving those problems. And finally, I would say don't be afraid to use it, but definitely go and learn about why use of singletons can be a problem so that you know what pitfalls to avoid. Thank you.